So the greatest problem facing the world, I think, is the need to act preventively, yet our seeming inability to do that in a way that makes a difference. Now, we could talk about that in the health field. We could talk about it in the area of climate change, which is perhaps the most well-known example of the need to act preventively before crisis occurs. In my area of armed conflict, it's particularly tragic in a sense, because we've heard over and over again that it's much better to act before violence or conflict occurs rather than react to it before it already has happened. What are the reasons why we can't? They seem to me to be quite interesting. We often hear that it's a result of a lack of political will. But one of the things that has been breaking my head over the last year is what political will is actually composed of, how we actually mobilize will. And partly that's an issue of the amount of time decision makers have to address a variety of different issues, and so they prioritize what's most urgent. But it seems to me that two challenges associated with prevention broadly are having the right kind of convincing information on the one hand, and on the other hand, having a credible, authoritative figure or body that can argue for why prevention is necessary now. So let me give you an example from armed conflict. So we can sometimes see that some of the root causes of conflict are present, but it's difficult to add those up. It's difficult to say that one society is going to spiral into violence versus another society that might have the same features. So having the reliable information that can actually point to some of the causes that really have an impact on the creation of violence, I think is still lacking, despite all the years of looking at this. But secondly, who is it that makes the decision that we should act now versus later? And I think the recent Libya crisis is a really good example of this, because the international community decided to act before mass atrocities were committed in the city of Benghazi, but there were all kinds of downsides of acting preventively, and retrospectively all sorts of criticisms about why Libya and not somewhere else, and on what basis did we make that decision. So the question of what kinds of actions, what kinds of signs should we act on, and which should we allow to just continue, it seems to me to be the big challenge of our time. On the information side, it seems to me that there's a lot of regional actors who monitor what's going on in societies that don't necessarily connect to global decision making. And although we talk rhetorically about bodies like the UN being connected to or cooperating with regional organizations, I'm not sure that we really do that effectively. So having some kind of mechanism by which information that's gathered by both governmental and non-governmental organizations, but that's organized around a common set of indicators, which we still lack, I think is hugely important. On the authoritative body, that's where I think we have a real challenge. And I'll give you the analogy of prevention in counterterrorism. It seems to me that those who criticize some of the preventive measures that have been taken inside societies, say like the United States, around counterterrorism, is A, that we're getting that information from dubious sources. We're wiretapping, we're hacking into people's phones, we're racial profiling, whatever we're doing. But also we don't quite trust who is acting on that information or suggesting who should act on it. So it's the CIA versus a judicial body. If you roll that up to the international community, it seems we have a similar kind of issue. How our information is being gathered, but also who acts on it. Who decides that we have a watch list of countries that are showing some symptoms of conditions under which we might expect conflict to occur? Is it the Security Council? Well, it seems to me that body is riddled with all kinds of politicization, which makes it hard for it to credibly act as that authoritative body. So it seems to me we may need to look at other organs within the United Nations, or perhaps even a new body that can authoritatively and impartially, to the degree that we can strive for that, make the claim that we should act in one case rather than another. Part of the solution, of course, is to think about how those bodies need to be reformed so as to speak to some of the concerns of different parts of the world. And we've talked a lot about Security Council or UN reform in the past. We haven't gotten very far. But there may be a moment, just like the moment that came in many societies when democracy was instituted and the noble classes and the elite classes began to give way on some of their privileges, that we may need to reach a similar point in time where we create greater representativeness partially to address this concern about institutional bias. What's the greatest challenge of our time, it seems to me, is to respond to the new kinds of violence we're seeing in societies. We have a remarkable fact that we're dealing with today, and that is that there has been a decline, a striking decline, in both the incidence of violence or conflict between states, and increasingly we're seeing in civil conflicts as well. And many of us may not notice this because we're so captivated by the awful conflicts we see on our television screens and on the internet, which are certainly continuing to wreak havoc for many civilians. But what the data shows pretty clearly from a variety of sources is that both the incidence and lethalness or lethality of armed conflict has been gradually declining over the last decades. Now, there's lots of people who talk about the reasons for this. You have Steven Pinker, who tells us it's about a change in human nature and values. You have other people talk about economic growth or deterrence, but nonetheless the fact is really striking. But the story doesn't stop there, and it seems to me the greatest challenge is to now look at the type of violence which is still occurring. So consider this interesting fact that roughly, or just over 500,000 people die in lethal violence in any given year. This has been the average over the last 5 years. Only 10% of those have been in situations of armed conflict, either international war or civil war. So what about the remaining 90%? Well, that 90% has been in situations of generalized violence. And the countries that are at the top of the list may surprise you. El Salvador, Guatemala, Jamaica, Mexico, Honduras. These are the societies that have the greatest concentration of violence today. The challenge, it seems to me, is how do we address that? UN peacekeeping, not necessarily a tool that would be relevant. Our traditional armies that Western societies and other societies are building may or may not be relevant, because the violence that we're seeing is a combination of political violence interspersed with criminal elements, but nonetheless it is widespread and systematic. Now it seems to me what we need to get at and address more systematically are the motives behind that violence, which are often economic. They may stem from unemployment, poverty, but are also clearly enhanced by the possibility of profit. The means that the perpetrators of this violence have at their disposal, and that's not necessarily the spread of nuclear weapons, we think about that in terms of high politics, but rather the flow of cheap, available weapons. And then lastly, some of the institutional factors that allow this kind of violence to continue. If you want to call it the culture of impunity that exists within a lot of these societies. Now, to me, this is the greatest challenge of our time if you're interested in minimizing violent death around the world. It's to acknowledge that war and conflict has changed fundamentally, but that it hasn't gone away. It's taken a new form, and we need to think really radically about the kinds of tools we're going to use to address it. one of the big controversies, of course, about taking an approach to violence like the one I've described is that it really tries to take seriously that these acts are committed by particular individuals, not necessarily parties to a conflict. And if you think about the way that the United Nations has approached conflict resolution, conflict prevention, it's tried to do that through a principle of impartiality, that you try to treat both sides as equal in order to reach some kind of settlement. Now, preventative approaches, particularly to conflict or violence, or if we're thinking about addressing some of the new types of violence that don't look like traditional armed conflict, seem to me to really challenge this, because they're asking us to really single out individuals and try to address what makes them tick and what might prevent them from acting. Which, by the same token, if you're using criminal justice mechanisms, may make it very hard to negotiate later on. So the tension I grapple with is the tension that's sometimes described in the literature as the peace versus justice debate. Do you try to punish and do what is just, or do you try to seek peace, some kind of solution which may involve making a deal with someone who's done something wrong? I think, despite all the challenges of doing this, that we need to take much more seriously the fact that violence, and particularly atrocities that might occur in the context of conflict, are committed by individuals, and we need to treat them as individuals. That's going to make it a lot harder to do deals.